There is a car that most people have never heard of, and that is exactly why it matters. Picture this: Geneva, Switzerland, March 1965. The motor show floor is alive with the smell of leather and engine oil. Every major manufacturer is there. And in the middle of all that noise, Italy walks in with something small, low, and absolutely devastating to look at. A two-seat open-top Roadster that cost less than a British sports car, weighed almost nothing, and had lines so clean it made grown men stop walking. This is not the story of a Ferrari. This is not the story of a Lamborghini. This is the story of something far more interesting, because it was built for the rest of us. The Fiat 850 Spider. Now, before you tune out, stay with me. Because this car has a backstory that is hiding in plain sight. A design drawn by one of the greatest automotive minds of the 20th century. A rivalry with one of Germany's most beloved classics, and a chapter of automotive history that almost nobody talks about anymore. The Volkswagen Karmann Ghia had been ruling the affordable beauty market since 1955, a decade of domination. 2000. Take the Beatles platform, dress it up with Italian bodywork from the Ghia studio, put the Karmann coach builder's name on it, and you have a recipe that worked beautifully. It was slower than it looked. It wasn't really a sports car, but it looked like it belonged in a film. And for a generation of buyers who wanted something stylish without selling a kidney, it was the answer. Italy watched, and Italy had a problem. Because in the mid-1960s, if you wanted an affordable open-top sports car, the choices were mostly British. MG Midget, Austin Healey Sprite, Triumph, Spitfire. All of them light, fun, relatively cheap. Germany had the Karmann Ghia. What did Italy have? Fiat had the 500, charming, iconic, but not exactly a roadster. Fiat had the 600, practical, rear-engined, brilliant for city streets. And now, Fiat had a plan. Use the bones of the humble 850 sedan, a rear-engined, rear-wheel drive compact that had just entered production in 1964, and hand the design brief to someone extraordinary. Don't build it in-house. Call in the best. Call in Bertone. And Bertone, in turn, handed the project to a young man who was about to change automotive history. His name was Giorgetto Giugiaro. He was 26 years old, and the day his car was revealed to the world at Geneva was the same day his first son was born. That is not a detail you make up. That is the kind of story that only real life produces. Let's talk about this man for a moment, because you cannot understand the Fiat 850 Spider without understanding who drew it. Giorgetto Giugiaro was born in 1938 in Garesio, a small town in northern Italy. His father and grandfather were both painters. Art was in the blood. But his hands were drawn to something faster than canvas. He was 17 when Dante Giacosa, Fiat's legendary technical director, spotted the boy's sketches and pulled him into the company. At 21, he became the youngest person ever appointed head of styling at Bertone, 21 years old, running the design center of one of Italy's most prestigious coach builders. At Bertone, he was extraordinary. The BMW 3200 CS, the Alfa Romeo Giulia GT, the Chevrolet Corvair Testudo concept, each one a small revolution. Each one proof that this was not an ordinary talent. And then came the 850 Spider brief. Fiat handed Bertone the platform from the 850 sedan, same wheelbase 2027 millimeters, same rear-mounted four-cylinder engine, same basic bones. The budget was constrained, the packaging was fixed. The challenge was to make it look like nothing that platform had any right to produce. Giugiaro's solution was to strip everything back to geometry: low waistline, clean flanks, not a single unnecessary crease. At the front, he extended the fenders to embrace recessed headlamps, then covered them with plexiglass lenses, angled flush with the bodywork, a detail he had first explored on the Bertone Testudo concept 2 years earlier. The effect was a face that looked both purposeful and slightly mysterious, like it knew something you didn't. At the rear, the taillights were shared with another car being developed in Turin at the same time, the Lamborghini Miura. Whether this was a cost decision, a design choice, or simply the way Italian coach building worked in the mid-60s, the result was a budget roadster wearing jewelry borrowed from a supercar. The fabric roof folded completely away under a rear body panel, leaving the cockpit open and the roofline uninterrupted. The Bertone badge, not the Fiat badge, sat on the front fenders. And in America, where Fiat's reputation was still finding its footing, the car would be marketed without the Fiat name at all. They called it simply the Bertone Spider. That name alone was enough. The Spider shared only its drive system, axles, and wheelbase with the regular 850 sedan. Everything above was Giugiaro's work. The result was a car that was 3,782 millimeters long, but only 1,220 millimeters tall. Think about that for a moment. Less than 1.25 meters off the ground. In 1965, that silhouette was something. When it debuted at Geneva on March the 7th, 1965, it was received, as one contemporary Italian motoring magazine put it, with genuine excitement, a combination of clean performance and refreshingly honest proportions. Even the critics who picked at its faults admitted the design had a kind of captivating lightness that was hard to define and impossible to ignore. His son Fabrizio arrived the same day. Giugiaro had produced two things on the 7th of March, 1965, that would outlast almost everything else from that era. Now, here is where the story gets interesting. Because beauty without substance is just a poster on a wall. The Fiat 850 Spider was not designed to sit in a museum. It was designed to be driven. And the numbers, when you look at them honestly, tell a story that almost nobody gave the car credit for. Under that rear deck sat an 843cc four-cylinder engine, less than a liter of displacement, producing 49 horsepower in its initial tune, with a top speed of around 145 kilometers per hour. That is not a brute force number. But here is what matters. The whole car weighed 725 kilograms. To put that in perspective, a modern city car weighs roughly double that. In 1965, even some small sports cars were considerably heavier. Weight is the enemy of fun. And the 850 Spider had very little of it. There was also an engineering quirk that most people never knew about. The rear-mounted engine in the 850 Spider rotated counterclockwise the same direction as a Chevrolet Corvair. It was not exotic. It was not advertised on the brochure. But it meant the chassis engineers had to account for unusual torque characteristics, and it gave the car a rear-biased balance that, in the right hands, made it genuinely engaging to push. The front drum brakes had been replaced with discs. The instrument panel had been redesigned specifically for the Spider sport seats, a new steering wheel, a dedicated gauge layout. This was not a sedan with the roof cut off. Every detail of the cabin had been rethought for a driver who wanted to feel the road. And now let us talk about the competition, because this is the part that makes you lean forward. In 1971, a buyer walking into an American showroom could pick up a Fiat 850 Sport Spider for $2,294. That same year, the Volkswagen Karmann Ghia convertible, that decade-old German icon, was priced at $2,750, $456 more expensive. And what did you get for that premium? 300 pounds of additional weight, 60 horsepower versus the Fiat's 58, the same basic number, in a car that was significantly heavier and cost noticeably more. The Triumph Spitfire that year, $2,649, 48 horsepower, 1,620 pounds heavier than the Fiat, more expensive than the Fiat. The 850 Spider was lighter, cheaper, and Italian. It moved better through a corner. It looked like something that had been sketched in a Milanese atelier, not assembled from a parts bin. So why did the Karmann Ghia get the fame? Why did the Triumph get the nostalgia? Why did the 850 Spider largely disappear from mainstream consciousness? Part of the answer is Fiat's reputation in export markets, particularly in the United States. where reliability concerns about Italian cars were already beginning to form. Part of it was the casual dealer network Fiat operated, which made parts and service difficult long after the cars stopped being sold. And part of it, honestly, was rust. The 850 Spider had a terminal relationship with moisture. Any example that survived into the following decades had usually done so through the dedicated attention of someone who genuinely cared. But before we get to the ending, we need to stop here, because if you are watching this channel and you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. This is exactly the kind of story we tell here, the cars that changed everything and got no credit for it. Hit subscribe, leave a comment telling us which car you think deserves more recognition than it ever got. And if this video has already taught you something, share it with someone who loves classic cars. They will thank you. Now, 1968. 3 years after the Geneva debut, Fiat came back with a revised version. They had listened, they had learned, and they were ready to push harder. The engine grew. From 843 cubic centimeters to 903, output climbed to 52 horsepower in standard tune. The car was renamed the 850 Sport Spider, and with its revised weight-to-power ratio, it was now capable of approaching 90 miles per hour, nearly 150 kilometers per hour, from less than 1 liter of displacement. In a car weighing under 3/4 of a ton, that felt considerably faster than the number suggests. The front end was restyled. The plexiglass headlamp covers were removed. The headlamps moved slightly forward, giving the car a different expression, what enthusiasts at the time described, affectionately, as a frog eye look. The flush turn indicators of the original were replaced with units mounted below the bumper. It was a cleaner, more assertive face, more purposeful than the original's slightly veiled elegance. Bertone's factory in Grugliasco, near Turin, built every single Spider that left the line. This was not a car assembled somewhere generic. It was coach-built, in the original sense of the word, by the same studio that designed it. The level of quality control this implied was a genuine differentiator in the budget sports car segment. Special editions followed: the Racer, with a body-colored metal hardtop; the Racer Berlinetta, with a black vinyl hardtop. Limited runs, distinctive specifications, aimed at buyers who wanted something that stood apart, even within a car that already stood apart. And the numbers bore out the ambition. By the time production ended in 1973, 124,600 Spiders had been made. Of those, approximately 100,000 were the Sport Spider variant. The car that Fiat had built as a response to British and German competition had, in 8 years, outsold almost every expectation. The US market, in particular, had embraced it. The gamble of marketing the car under the Bertone name rather than Fiat had paid off. American buyers, attracted by Italian design and put off by Italian brand uncertainty, had responded to the coach builder's name on the fender with something approaching trust. It was a quiet, pragmatic piece of marketing that worked better than anyone had planned. But there is a thread in this story that runs beneath all the numbers and the market data, a thread that makes the 850 Spider something more than a footnote in Fiat's catalog. Remember Giugiaro, the 26-year-old who drew the car while his son was being born? By November of 1965, just 8 months after the Geneva reveal, he was gone from Bertone. A new designer had arrived, a young man named Marcello Gandini, who would go on to design the Lamborghini Miura, the Lancia Stratos, and the Alfa Romeo Montreal. 2 visionaries in the same building. 2 geniuses competing for the same air. Giugiaro felt the walls closing in. He moved to Ghia. Then, in 1968, he founded his own studio, Ital Design, with his partner, Aldo Mantovani. From there, the work that followed was staggering in its scope: the Volkswagen Golf, the Volkswagen Scirocco, the Lotus Esprit, the Maserati Bora, the DeLorean DMC 1, 2, the Alfa Romeo Alfa Sud. Giugiaro was eventually named Car Designer of the Century by an international jury in 1999. And, among his hundreds of designs, The small Italian Roadster he drew in 1964 and 65, the one that arrived at Geneva the same morning his son took his first breath, remains one of the most perfectly proportioned cars he ever produced. Here is the hidden irony that almost nobody tells you. Giugiaro, who designed the Fiat 850 Spider specifically to challenge the Volkswagen Karmann Ghia, later became the man who designed the Volkswagen Golf, the car that replaced the Beetle-based platform the Karmann Ghia had ridden to fame. The man who tried to dethrone the king ended up defining the kingdom's next era. History does not do subtlety. Production of the Fiat 850 Spider ended in 1973. The world was changing. Emissions regulations were tightening. Fuel crises were reshaping priorities. The era of the small, uncomplicated open roadster, built on a humble platform, was drawing to a close. Its spiritual successor, when it arrived, was nothing like it. The Fiat Zon 9th, which entered production in 1972 as the 850 Spider was winding down, was a mid-engined wedge designed by Bertone, again by Bertone, but this time with a completely different philosophy. It was angular, where the 850 had been rounded. It was technically adventurous, where the 850 had been elegantly simple. It was a product of a different decade, a different mood. The 850 Spider has never fully recovered its reputation, not in the way the Karmann Ghia has, not in the way the Triumph Spitfire has, or the MG Midget. Those cars have clubs, rallies, magazine covers, and strong collector communities. The 850 Spider exists in a quieter space known to those who know, largely invisible to everyone else. And in that invisibility, there is something worth understanding. Because the cars that get celebrated loudest are often the ones that benefited from better marketing, better dealer networks, or simply better geography. The Karmann Ghia was German. Germany had infrastructure. Germany had Volkswagen's distribution system working in its favor across 2 continents. The British sports cars had the English language and cultural proximity to the American market working for them. Fiat had a great car and a complicated relationship with export markets. That combination, in the 1960s and 70s, was often a death sentence for a car's long-term legacy. But here is what the collector market is starting to tell us now, in 2026. Auction results over the past several years show decent sports Spiders selling for between £10,000 and £17,000 in the United Kingdom. Rarer, well-preserved examples, particularly the Abarth-tuned variants, have achieved prices approaching $28,000 at major American auction houses. The average sale price on the global market sits around $10,000 to $11,000 for a presentable car. These are not Ferrari numbers, they are not Porsche numbers. But for a car that was largely forgotten for decades, the trajectory is upward. Slowly, and without fanfare, the 850 Spider is being rediscovered, not by speculators looking for the next bubble, by drivers. By people who appreciate what a 725-kilogram open roadster with no electronic aids and a sub-1-liter engine actually feels like to push down a back road. It feels honest, brutally, wonderfully honest. There are no screens, no driver modes, no artificially weighted steering. There is you, the road, the rear-mounted engine doing its quiet work behind your shoulders, and the wind doing its loud work across your face. It is a car that asks you to be present. That is not a small thing. The rust problem is real. Any buyer needs to examine a potential purchase on a lift, carefully, looking at every seam and sill, with the seriousness the issue deserves. Parts availability has improved slightly as the restoration community has grown, but sourcing original components remains a genuine challenge, particularly the auxiliary hardtops offered on the special editions. But if you find a sound one, a car that has been properly sorted, properly cared for, kept away from the salt and the damp, what you have is a piece of Italian design history made by one of the greatest designers who ever lived, at the peak of his powers. During the single year in which both his masterpiece and his first child arrived in the world on the same day. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Let us end where we began. Geneva, March the 7th, 1965. A young Italian designer stands near the Bertone stand as the show opens. Somewhere across the city, his wife is in labor. On the stand, his car is drawing a crowd that is stopping, staring, leaning in. The lines are doing what good lines always do. They make people feel something before they understand why. That car, the Fiat 850 Spider, went on to be built in 124,000 examples. It undercut the Karmann Ghia on price. It was lighter than the Triumph. It was drawn by the man who would go on to design the Volkswagen Golf, the Lotus Esprit, and the DeLorean. It wore taillights, borrowed from the Lamborghini Miura. It was sold in America under a coach builder's name because the manufacturer's own name wasn't considered strong enough. And yet, most people who love classic cars have only a vague idea it exists. That is the real lesson of the 850 Spider. Not the horsepower figure, not the weight, not even the design. The lesson is this: the cars that shape the story are not always the ones that get credited. Sometimes the most important thing in the room is also the quietest. Sometimes genius arrives without fanfare and leaves without a proper farewell. And decades later, if you're paying attention, you find it sitting in a field somewhere in Tuscany or a garage in California, a little rough, a little orange around the edges, and you recognize it for what it always was: Italy's answer to the Karmann Ghia, and in many ways, the better one. The 850 Spider did not need your validation to be beautiful. It did not need the trophies. It did not need the magazine covers. It was beautiful because Giugiaro drew it that way, in a white heat of creative certainty, in the months before his son was born, before the world told him he was one of the greats. Some things know what they are before anyone else does. If this story made you see a car you had dismissed or never noticed in a completely different light, that is exactly what this channel is here to do. There are dozens of cars like this. Stories hiding behind the famous names. Machines that changed the game without getting the credit. So if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every week, we go looking for the cars the history books forgot, and we bring them back where they belong. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and come back next time. And before you go, leave a comment. Which overlooked classic do you think deserves its moment? Which car from your lifetime never got the recognition it earned? Tell us below. We read every single one. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with a friend who loves cars. Not the ones who only know the obvious names. The ones who are ready for the real story. Because the real story is always better.